Sweet in the morning, oh Lord, it's sweet in the morning.
This is an interview with former mayor of Birmingham, David Vann, for the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute's Oral History Project by Dr. Horace Huntley at Miles College, February 2nd, 1995 at 2:30 p.m. Mayor Vann, I want to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule today to come out and talk with us.
It's a pleasure.
We want to just start today by just getting a little background. Like, who are you? We know that you've been around and you've been involved in really changing the whole concept of what Birmingham was about. But let me just ask you about your parents. Tell me a little about your mother and father. Where were they born? Were they Birminghamians?
Well, my father was born on my great-grandfather's farm in the area we now call Huffman. Most of Huffman was a part of my great-grandfather Joel King Vann's farm. And he was second generation in the county. His father brought him as a baby from North Carolina in 1822, settled in the Trussville area. My mother was from Minneapolis, Minnesota. She had a brother that was a mining engineer and came to Birmingham with a cousin, and they started several businesses. But his wife died somewhere around 1907 or 8.
Mm-hmm.
And my mother and her mother came to Birmingham to look after the daughter and help her brother Walter. My mother taught school, the Birmingham school system. She taught at Oldham, she taught at Forest Lake. And at the time, my father graduated from the North Alabama Conference College, I believe in 1902. That was the second graduating class on that campus.
That's Birmingham Southern now?
Well, it is now, and my grandfather, Felix Vann, was in the real estate business in Old Ealerton. And family tradition is that he and a group of Ealerton businessmen raised $6,000 and went to the Methodist Church and said they wanted to start a college at Owington, which was an unincorporated area north of Ealerton. And the Owens family apparently donated some land on top of the hill, and the businessmen promised that if they'd start the college, they would have the first building ready within a year. And they had a big argument as to whether you should build a Christian college at a wicked, wicked place like Birmingham. At that time, there was a saloon on every corner downtown. About 4 breweries. Jack Daniel whiskey was distilled on 2nd Avenue, I think. And there were brothels up and down the railroad tracks. And it was sort of like a Wild West town still. But they said this is out in the country in the fresh air. And so they started, they opened in 97 as the North Alabama Conference College. They changed the name to Birmingham College about 1910. And then I think it was in 1918, the Methodist Church was faced with the problem of having 2 colleges and not many students because the young men were going to war. And they merged the 2 colleges and it became Birmingham Southern. And most of the history of Birmingham Southern, they talk about the history of Southern University, which started, I think, in 1842. But I've always thought they ought to put some emphasis in the North Alabama Conference College, because if it hadn't been for the efforts of those gentlemen to get that college started, there wouldn't be a Birmingham Southern College here. My father stayed after graduation. They had everything from first grade through fourth year college. And so they had a grammar school and high school, and my father stayed as principal.
Oh.
And stayed there, I think, about till 1909, and then he went down to the university and got his law degree. I believe it was a 2-year law program in those years. And I believe I have his diploma on my wall. I believe it's dated 1911. Or when?
So then he practiced law here in Birmingham?
No. He had a brother that had tuberculosis. And the doctor said he ought to go live in the mountains. My grandfather had become a Methodist minister after this business of starting the college. And that meant his children could go to the new college free. And it was the first generation of my family that got to have a college education. And I've always thought Grandpa was pretty smart, helped start a college so his children get a college education. But they moved, the bishop gave my grandfather Felix a church at Fruithurst, Alabama, in the mountains. And Dad started his law practice in Heflin so he could be near his brother. Then later he moved to Roanoke, Alabama, and I was born in Roanoke, which is the largest town in Randolph County, but Wedowee is the county seat. And Dad was elected circuit solicitor, which was the district attorney in effect of that era. And then in 1931, I believe he was appointed circuit judge by Governor Miller. And he died in 1934, about a week before election. He was running for re-election. The house was full of campaign material. 2 years later, my mother decided the best way to get a college education for her children was move to a college town. And so she picked up the family and sold the house and gave herself a little stake and moved to Auburn. And my 2 older brothers went to Auburn. My sister had gotten married. She went to the University of Michigan.
So there were 4 of you?
There were 4 of us.
Mm-hmm. Where were you? You were the youngest?
I was the youngest. Okay. And my mother sold insurance and Reader's Digest, and we had a boarding house, not a boarding house, but a rooming house. We had 4 or 5 college students living with us. But she finally got a job with it was the General Accounting Office that audited the federal farm programs through an office at Auburn. And but the year I graduated from high school, her job got moved to Birmingham, and she had to transfer to the federal crop insurance. And so I was going to have to be a boarding student. I thought I'd go to Auburn always, you know. But Mother said, I'd go talk to the people down at the university. Your dad went there. And I went down there, and the dean of students fixed me up with one job for my room and another job for my food and some spending money. I waited on the football training table for the last Alabama Rose Bowl teams. They made the pact with the Big Ten the next year, and Alabama couldn't go to the Rose Bowl anymore. They'd been there as much as any school in the country. And
so you worked your way through college?
Well,
primarily.
At the end of in June of, must have been 46, right at the end of the war was over as far as the fight was concerned, but it wasn't officially over. And I thought I'd be drafted in August when I become 18. And so a friend of mine, we decided, well, let's just start in June. So we volunteered and joined the Army. Had to have my mother's permission because I was only 17. And I spent a year and a half in the Army in the occupation of Korea. The Japanese Army pulled out, and the American Army went in and set up a military government until they could organize their own government. And I was barely 18. They made me a criminal investigator because I had a year and a half of college. And I told them I was going to study law. And I joined in June. By October, I was in Korea, and I had a Jeep and a driver and a two-way radio and a Korean interpreter.
This
And
was at the time when
They put me out investigating cases.
This was at the time that the military was just then being integrated. Isn't that
Well, no, it wasn't. It was segregated.
Okay.
And I spent a year there, and I qualified for the GI Bill, which assured me that I would be able to go to law school. And I didn't use my GI Bill until I got to law school. I came back to Alabama, and I had a job, and I was the technical director of the University Theater. As a high school student, I'd worked with the Auburn Players and learned how to build scenery. They could find plenty of people that liked to act, but not many people that wanted to use hammers and nails and paint and make the sets. So I did that for 2 years, and then I went to law school. And I got called to active duty in my senior year in law school, and I went back in the Army as a counterintelligence officer. And now it was an integrated Army in that 3-4 year period. And I had black agents that worked for me. I had gotten a commission. And it was sort of interesting. They came from all over the country, but if they had personal problems, they always came to me. Somehow they trusted me as a Southerner better than they trusted those Yankee boys.
How different was the military as a segregated institution then as an integrated?
Well, the segregated Army that I was in, all the black soldiers were in trucking companies or laundry companies or
Supply,
those kind of things. And I really seldom saw black soldiers.
But you did have black investigators?
When I went back in 51, I had black counterintelligence agents that worked under me. Yeah.
Well, after when you left the military the second time, what did you do?
Well, I was about to finish my master's degree in law at George Washington. While I was in the Army, I went to night law school, and they had a 2-year program that you'd go 3 nights a week. And I didn't know anybody and didn't have any tie-ups or commitments, so I went 5 nights a week and did the whole program in 1 year. But I got out of the Army in April. I got a job with the General Counsel of the National Labor Relations Board, doing appellate briefs. So I was writing briefs all day and then going to law school all night. It was pretty miserable the last 2 months. And then about the early part of June, Justice Black's law clerk called me up and said, Justice Black would like to meet me. And I hadn't worked for the government long enough to have any leave, but I said I could take my lunch hour anytime I wanted to. And so the law clerk came by. He'd been a student at Alabama with me. And he took me out to Justice Black's home in Alexandria. And we chatted for a while. My father had been a supporter of him when he ran for the Senate. And they had both been moved to the Knights of Pythias, so he remembered my father. And after we talked for a little while, he said, well, I've decided I want you to be my law clerk this year. And at the time, I didn't even know I was an applicant to be his law clerk. So just out of the blue. And 2 weeks later, I was at the Supreme Court of the United States. He asked me what I wanted to do, and I said I was going back to Alabama to practice law. And the school desegregation case was pending Brown against the board. He said, well, maybe you don't want to be my law clerk. I said, oh, yes, I want to be your law clerk. And I knew how the case was going to be decided. Anybody that read Justice Black's opinions knew how that case was going to be decided as far as his vote. And then in May, it was sort of interesting. We had a deal, the law clerks and the justices. It was really made by our predecessors that the justices would not discuss Brown against the Board of Education with their law clerks. We didn't want to be blamed for a news leak. And there were reporters all over that building every day just trying to get some inside information. And the day the case came down, I never discussed it with him. And the day the case came down, I lived with him. We had breakfast together every morning and dinner together every night. And I drove his car, drove him to the Supreme Court building. And they met at noon in those days. And just before noon, I stuck my head in his office and said, Judge, anything you need before you go on the bench today? And he said, no, everything's fine. So I think I'll go to lunch. He said, that's fine. No hint, no indication of any kind that it was going to be an important historical day. But I went into Justice Jackson's law clerk's office, and his name was Barrett Prettyman Jr. And I said, Barrett, let's go to lunch. Barrett said, I can't, my judge is here. And that was right, startling news, because Jackson had a heart attack. He'd been out for at least 2 or 3 weeks in the hospital. And I just said to myself, there's only one reason they would bring him from the hospital. They're going to hand down Brown today. And I ran downstairs, well, not ran, but walked fast downstairs, where the law clerks had a dining room where they went through the public cafeteria line to have a place to eat that was private. I said, let's go upstairs. They brought Jackson from the hospital. They're going to hand down Brown. And several of the clerks said, oh, my judge would have given me a hint. I've got an appointment. I got this, that. And only 6 of us went upstairs to hear Warren read Brown against the Board of Education. And it's sort of interesting because I was looking up and down the bench as to who's going to dissent. I mean, this is such a controversial case. Surely, I would expect a dissent. And I looked in the face of every one of those justices, Justice Clark, Justice Minton, Justice Reed, Justice Burton, William Douglas. I didn't expect him to dissent. I looked at Frankfurter. I thought he might. And then I looked in Justice Black, and I couldn't read anything in their faces. And about 2/3 through, well before the end of the opinion, the decision is announced. And Warren read, he said that we therefore hold that segregation by race in public schools violates the 14th Amendment. But when he read it, he added the word. He said, we therefore unanimously hold. And everybody in the room relaxed. And I saw the chief in the hall that evening, and I said to him, I said, Chief, when you read that opinion today, you didn't read it like you wrote it. And the big Swedish face clouded up. He said, what do you mean? I said, you added the word unanimously. He said, well, I thought it was getting kind of tense in there about that time. And I've told that story many times. But somebody's recently written a biography of Strom Thurmond. And I think the chapter was about how Strom Thurmond now has black people on his staff. And I think it somehow, but anyway, that story about me meeting the Chief Justice is in Strom Thurmond's biography, which I thought was sort of interesting.
But tell me just from curiosity's sake, something about Remo Douglas.
One of the most brilliant men you would ever meet. He only used one law clerk. He had a second law clerk, but he used that law clerk, I think, to help him write books. And Douglas was in constant motion. He wasted a minute. He had something productive to do every minute. And he was so smart that he would write an opinion, and then while in Justice Black's office, we might go over that opinion through 15 drafts. We would have a comma draft where we went through to see if we could figure a way to get rid of commas. Judge thought commas messed up the English language. And shortened sentences. And then we had one draft. Justice Black never wanted to write quotable quotes. He had a feeling that in the past, judges had written decisions and included colorful words that got established as rules of law, when he wanted you to have to read his entire opinion in one piece and look at the whole thing, not be able to pick out a quotable quote. Of course, he did write some quotable quotes, but he really intentionally did not want to do that. And but Douglas would just, I think he'd do maybe 2 drafts and out it goes. And so some of his writing is, while he was a wonderful writer, an experienced writer, a professional writer, I think some of his opinions are a little unfinished. compared to what we did. And of course, his personal life was complicated. I think he married 3 times. But he was an interesting, but sort of taciturn. He came to dinner. When I lived with the judge, these other judges would come to dinner, so I'd get to spend evenings with other members of the court, in effect, which was a wonderful educational program, really unbelievable. But Douglas was sort of taciturn. He didn't talk a lot.
Yeah. He wrote I believe it's a small volume entitled Points of Rebellion. That
I'm not familiar with that book.
Yeah, that many of the young and ambitious revolutionaries of the 60s and 70s looked at very favorably. And I always wondered what kind of individual he was.
Well, he was a very, it's sort of interesting. You saw him, he was sort of a cold personality, except with people that knew him real, real well. I think, but at the same time, he was a very warm person and very conscious of the problems of people and the complications of life. He wrote the Security Exchange Act. He was the head of the SEC. Very complex organizational structure. There was no limits to his mental capacities, but he also had a very, very warm. I understand after he retired, he tried to come back on the court. He got upset, but he wanted to have his say.
Right.
But he made mistakes like everybody else. I think some of their early cases following Brown, particularly the Richmond case, where instead of treating the county as a whole with respect to racial segregation, they held the proper thing was to have a separate city school system, separate county school system. And in the Detroit case, where the judge made his desegregation order to cover all the suburban schools as well as the Detroit schools, and the Supreme Court overruled that and set a pattern that really, in effect, condemned all cities in the United States to be poor blacks in the core and the wealthier whites living in suburbs around it. Birmingham's not inconsistent with that.
How long were you in D.C. and when did you return to Birmingham?
Well, I went there probably in early '52 in the Army, and I spent a year in the Army and a year with the judge, and I came to Birmingham in the fall of 1954, probably August 1954, with the law firm of White, Bradley, all in Rose, now Bradley. He ran.
So you were actually back in Birmingham during the Montgomery Bus Boycott.
Oh, yes.
Did you have any dealings with anyone that was associated with the bus boycott at the time?
Not at that time. Justice Black's sister-in-law, Mrs. Clifford Durr, I knew her.
Right.
And I later became, and I knew but didn't know anything about what he was doing, Robert Hughes, young Methodist minister, that Bishop Claire Purcell had appointed, given a special appointment to the Alabama Council on Human Relations. He and I had been students at the university at the same time and gone to work through the Wesley Foundation program at the university. And he went to seminary and I went to law school. He came to Birmingham shortly after the bus boycott and contacted me. And for several years I worked very closely with Bob. I couldn't do public legal work and he knew that. But I ended up on the board of the Alabama Council and spent many weekends meeting at Alabama State. We held meetings. Dr. Gomillion of Tuskegee was on our board, and a delightful, wonderful man. Joe Lowry was on our board. He had a Methodist church at that time in Mobile. He had earlier been the pastor at St. Paul's in Birmingham, I think. He wasn't as active. Reverend Wilson was a minister at St. Paul's. I spent many hours with him. He later was the chaplain at Tuskegee.
What board was this?
The board of the Alabama Council on Human Relations. When the NAACP was outlawed, we became virtually the only biracial group in Alabama. And Arthur Shores, John and Deanie Drew, I knew them well.
Was this one of the organizations that sort of filled the void left by the NAACP? Did you look at it in that manner?
No, I don't look at it in that manner. I think Reverend Shuttlesworth's
Alabama
Christian Movement of Human Rights more nearly filled, and of course the NAACP Legal Research continued to work with that group. We mainly were communicators. We met and we puzzled. And I would say in 1959, 1960, by that time we had somewhat concluded that it was going to be very difficult to make social change in Alabama until you got the power structure to take that as a program. And I worked with
the business of the political side.
The business side.
Okay.
You know, the political side simply reflects things. Very little is created in the political side of things. First, I worked with, I can't remember the minister's name right now. He's in Brooklyn now, I think. But Oliver, Reverend Oliver.
Right.
There was a project that I worked with him on. Every time there was a police brutality incident that he heard about, he would go and take affidavits from the people that were involved. And I would reproduce those. We had a mailing list, and we sent about 50 top business people in Birmingham copies of those affidavits every time we had one. And the thinking was that people that lived in Mountain Brook and over the mountain would come to work and go home, and they really didn't know much about segregation. They didn't know what was going on in their city. And we wanted to make sure they knew what was going on. What effect that had, I do not know. I think the most critical thing that happened that turned things around was the Freedom Riders coming to Birmingham. The bus being burned in Anniston, the other bus coming on to Birmingham, Connor refusing to give police protection to the Freedom Riders, and his minister, who's still living, I think was at City Hall personally pleading with Connor to provide police protection. And Connor said they're looking for trouble, they're going to find him. When I was mayor, I checked the radio tapes, and there was a good 5 minutes between the time the first report came in on the police radio and the time any policeman appeared at the scene. And probably things had been going on for 5 or so minutes before that. But you had this group of thugs meet that bus and beat up the people that got off the bus. And they also beat up people that were simply waiting for a bus. People that had nothing to do with the Freedom Riders got beaten up just because they happened to be at the bus station. And for some reason, the national news people thought that the bus was coming to the Greyhound station. And instead it came to the Trailway station. And Tom Langford, who's still a photographer at the Birmingham Post-Herald, took the pictures of the beating. And one of the smarter Klansmen grabbed his camera, and he knew about cameras. It's the lens that makes the picture, so he broke the lens and threw away the camera, and of course the pictures were all inside, undisturbed by his action. And the camera was recovered from a trash can, I think, in the alley. And the Post-Herald was a Scripps Howard paper, and he immediately put that on the wire And it was on the front page of newspapers all around the world. And the city had been very defensive when other people came in and criticized us, whether it be Harrison Salisbury or CBS News or any writers that came through. But this time, their own people were beaten up. Clancy Lake, newsman from WAPI television, was beaten up. I think they broke the windshield in his car. He was parked outside. And that picture ran, I say, around the world. And at that particular time, they were having the International Rotary Convention in Tokyo, Japan. And the incoming chairman of the Chamber of Commerce, Sidney Smyer, was there with his group, and they looked at that picture. And they said, you know, we can't take this anymore. And so Connor's action really stimulated the business community to start figuring, how can we get rid of this guy? And they came back and they formed a committee. It was a secret committee. They called themselves the Senior Citizens. And it was made up of top CEOs from Birmingham businesses, partners from big law firms. One of our partners was a member, but not active. And bankers. And they started planning. And one thing they saw was that if they could change the form of city government, that might be a way to get rid of Connor. And they asked the Birmingham Bar Association to make a study of what kind of government would be best for Birmingham. And they were pushed on somewhat in that in the fall of '61, the federal judge, Judge Grooms, entered the order requiring the desegregation of Birmingham parks. And the commission immediately said close the parks, and it sent a message to the Birmingham Park Board to close the parks. Former Mayor Jimmy Morgan had been appointed to the Park Board, and he didn't get on the Park Board to close the parks. He got on the Park Board to build a zoo. And the Park Board defied the commission, which had appointed them. And that was one of the most interesting things that happened. It was very rare for a city agency to stand up and just face down the commission. But the commission had to handle the Alabama law required them to appropriate $50,000 a year to the parks. And that's an old law when $50,000 was a lot more money. But the rest of their money was budgeted by the city. And so when the park board wouldn't close the parks, they repealed the budget of the park board and forced them to fire all their employees. And I'm told that they had concrete poured down the holes on the city golf courses so nobody could sneak on and play a game of golf. The Bar Association made the study, and in February of '62, they recommended a change to American Council of Government. But they also recommended about 3 or 4 amendments to the law. And if you'd followed their plan, you couldn't have had a change in city government for 2 or 3 years probably. And I frankly thought you couldn't get, the legislature wasn't going to make changes if they were choosing sides, because Alabama politics for many years has run on what I call the law of enemies. If you don't make any enemies, you can get reelected. If you make enemies, you can't get reelected. And so the less a public official does, the less people he makes mad. I don't know, they say that one member of the legislature served 5 terms, never introduced a bill, left the floor at every controversial vote, and got reelected 5 times because he didn't make anybody mad, didn't do anything to make anybody mad. Didn't do anything to make anybody proud of him either, but that's beside the point.
Let me ask you a question about when you talked about the Freedom Riders coming in.
Yeah.
And of course they were attacked. In black communities, there was the idea that the police and the Klan was one and the same. How would you react to?
Well, I don't think they were one and the same, but I'll say this. if I went to a meeting at the Congregational Church on Center Street, which was a place where our Alabama Council meetings were frequently held, there might be a story in the Klan newspaper the next week saying David Vann was out there. And I really think there were probably informers that informed for the police department and for the FBI at the same time. In fact, the famous picture of the beating, there's a guy with very close-cut hair. His back is to the camera. His name was Gary. I can't remember his last name right now. But anyway, when I was mayor, Bill Baxley and I worked in support of each other to get the Justice Department to open the files on the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church. And the FBI had lost all the physical evidence. There were some Birmingham police officers that really would have loved to be the one that broke the case. I mean, they were like, if the Birmingham police could solve that case, that would be a great coup. And so they worked with Bill. But I got to read, the Justice Department had refused to give Birmingham that evidence for years. And refused to give the district attorney that evidence for years. And I suppose they thought that they wouldn't prosecute. And they might have been true if they'd given them to him in '62. But Bill Baxter, that was the thing he wanted to do. He had promised Chris McNair he would do that. And Chris's daughter, as you know, was killed, one of the 4 children that was killed.
This is in the 70s that you are referring to now.
Yes. Mm-hmm. But Carter's Justice Department did give us files. And there was an interview with this guy whose picture's in there. And it was a closed meeting of a congressional committee, so it was never published. But they asked him, says, "Is that you in the picture?" And he said, "Yes." He says, "Well, why have you always denied it?" He said, "The FBI told me to." The FBI said if I was asking, "Is that you?" I was given a name, but I was always supposed to say, "No, that's William Jones," or whatever the name was. He was supposed to positively identify by another name. And of course, that case was eventually broken because the niece became the testified. And Harold Raines, in an article in the New York Times magazine, said that one reason it wasn't prosecuted was that the man's wife was an FBI informant. And they were afraid that if he ever learned that, he'd murder her. Oh. And to protect their source, there was no prosecution for, over 10 years.
Because you were active in those early years, in the 50s and 60s, with the council, then you were called on by the businessmen to sort of interact between them.
No, that really had very little to do with it. The thing that gave me an unusual position was I probably knew, there probably weren't but 3 or 4 white people that knew as many black leaders as I did and had a personal relationship with them. But the way I really got involved in the other end was I was the organizer for Kennedy in the 1960 campaign. John Grenier and I were in the same law firm, and he asked to be given some time to campaign for for Nixon. And I said, "Well, if you're going to do that, let me campaign for Kennedy." And the law firm, being a great institution, freed both of us to work in that presidential campaign. And they made me the organization chairman. And I organized a committee in every box in the county. And when the election was over, Bob Vance, who later was a federal judge and was assassinated by the bail bomb, he and I and several young people, the official party had refused to support Kennedy. And not pass resolutions, they just were hands off. And so a group of us young guys managed to take over the campaign, and the Governor Patterson, was a strong Kennedy supporter. He was, and so we had the governor's office, and we had, John Sparkman, George Huddleston, they supported Kennedy, but virtually no state official, or they were just all scared. Don't make enemies, that rule of don't make enemies. Well, I also was one of the attorneys in the Alabama reapportionment case. And I was aware of the Bar Association study, but at that particular time, we were in court trying to get the first reapportionment order in the country, which we did in June. Bob Vance and I intervened and asked the court to delay a decision until the legislature, give the legislature of Alabama one more chance. And Patterson did call a special session, and they did pass 2 reapportionment bills. And they set up a special election in August to elect the new, they'd increased the Senate to 67. So there were going to be a lot of new senators elected, and they had made some rather conservative changes in the member of the House, but I think this county was going to get 2 more representatives or something. Well, we got the federal court to hold those plans were unconstitutional. And we had this special election in August that the legislature had already called. The court didn't have to call an election because the election was already called by the legislature. And I was busy promoting that. We had worked hard to get that order. We were very proud to have the first reapportionment order in the United States. And we wanted good people to be elected. We'd had a committee persuade what we call good people to run. And I was trying to promote the vote. And I'm riding down the road, and Dave Campbell, who had the talk show of those days, came on with his morning editorial to try to, which he did every morning to try to stir up interest for his night program. And Abe Berkowitz had been on that Bar Association committee, and he'd been making the rounds of civic clubs talking about changing the city government. And Dave said, well, you know, we either ought to get up a petition and change and have an election on it, or we ought to get behind the government we've got. It's not good for a city to be split. And I said, well, you know, he can sit up there on the mountain and pontificate easily, but getting a petition. Glen Iris Civic Club on the South Side had tried to get a petition. And Mr. Connor had just sent plainclothes detectives around to pick up the petitions as fast as they were signed. And I said, you got to have security. But when I got to my office, I said, you know, if I had me a petition booth across the street from every polling place 10 days from now, when this special election was going to happen, I believe I could get a petition in a single day. And we could have voting lists that are published in the newspaper. We could check people off, make sure the signatures were valid. And we could send somebody around to pick up petitions once an hour. So if Connor tried to get some of them, we'd have most of them because we'd have a security system of our own. And I called up Abe and I said, Abe, you really want to change the city government? I have figured out how to do it. And I told him briefly what my plan was. He called me back and said the executive committee of the Chamber of Commerce would like to meet with me at 2 o'clock that afternoon. I said, well, I'll be glad to meet with them, but I want to bring the president of the Birmingham Labor Council with me. Oh, businessmen and labor don't talk together very good. Look, this is a big decision, I said. If you're going to do this and win it, you've got to have both business and labor for it. And I believe I can bring the labor unions with me. And I had known Don Stafford very well from the Kennedy election campaign. And I called Don, and Don said, oh, yeah, I'll come. So we had this meeting at Mr. Smyer's office, and I outlined my simple plan. And some of the businessmen said, well, this is too important a thing to do in 10 days' notice. And it needs to be planned carefully. And he went around, my labor man said, you know, I've been sitting here thinking, you know, why hadn't we thought of this before? Why, let's go. And they finally, I always think my labor man talked the businessmen into doing it. And they said, well, they made a list. They said, we need to get 10 or 12 leading citizens that are non-controversial to head this up. And they made a list of about 25 businessmen they thought would fit those. Some of them may have been other than businessmen, but most of them were businessmen. And we said we'll meet the next day. Well, came back the next day, all 25 had turned us down. They said, we'll donate money, but I do business with the city. I sell cars to the city. I have insurance with the city. I have all these things. And old Smyer he'd been a Dixiecrat politician, member of the legislature, knew government on its practical side. He leaned back, and I'll never forget, he said, if we can't get 12 silk stockings, let's get 500 anybody's. And his son and I we went to law school together, went back and mimeographed off this thing and said, I hereby agree to be a member of the Birmingham Citizens for Progress, to sponsor a petition to give the people of Birmingham the right to decide for themselves what form of government is best for their city. And you could sign that without making any particular commitment. And we mimeographed these off and gave everybody a stack of them. Because they didn't have Xerox machines. We had to, I don't know what a mimeograph machine. But I then said, you know, you can talk to 25 businessmen and not get in the paper, but you can't go out recruiting 500 people without it getting in the paper. I want your permission to go to the papers, tell them what we're doing, but get them to agree that it's not news till we get our committee. And I met with some of the editorial staff of the Birmingham News, and they agreed that till we know whether we can get your committee, it's not news. And I went to the editor of the Post-Herald, Jimmy Mills. He gave me the same commitment. And that was a Thursday. Friday, nothing in the paper. Saturday, nothing in the paper. Sunday, the home edition, which I can't even find a copy of today, and but it had my picture on the front page. Hugo Black's law clerk, help write the school desegregation.
Okay.
Now, I said the Birmingham News had this, I believe, a front page story, my recollection. I can't find a copy of it.
Sunday morning.
Sunday morning. The official copy in the library has a story on the inside page, but only one, the Birmingham News in those days printed about 6 or 7 different editions. And the one, I can't find this one. Maybe there's somebody out there, turn it up sooner or later. Anyway, it had my picture on the front page. Hugo Black's law clerk, when the court wrote the school desegregation case, trying to run Bull Connor out of City Hall. And I said, you know, they got the knife in my back and they're twisting it, and telephone rang and said, oh, here comes the phone call. Well, the phone call was from one of the Republican committee people from Roebuck. And he said, that's a great idea. Can we help? And so all of a sudden, without any prior planning, we had the Kennedy for President people, the Nixon for President people, the labor unions, and the Chamber of Commerce, and the Real Estate Board, and the PTA Council.
And the Republicans.
Well, we had the Nixon for President people. Now, in those days, the Republicans were a right tight-knit group, and their main objective was to control the patronage when they got a Republican president. They really were not very keen on letting all these strangers that just formed committees come in. So in a sense, the Republicans at that point in time were outsiders, just like our Democratic committee were outsiders to the official committee. But I had studied the election returns of the May primaries, and it was very interesting because for the first time that I could recall, the black boxes and the South Side boxes and the over the mountain boxes all voted against George Wallace together, and George Wallace was unable to carry Jefferson County. And I said, if you can put those forces together, the liberal Democrats, the Republicans, and the black vote, we can win. And I had that, you know, pretty well fixed. And sure enough, 10 days later, we put out our petition. Smyer had improved the plan a little bit. He said he'd print the petitions, but he printed them with snap-out carbon. So when you signed one, you actually signed 5 copies. And we needed 7,500 names. We got 12,000 in one day, almost 12,000. I'm not sure anybody ever knows the full number. But, so we came from out of the blue. In one day, we had enough votes. There were almost enough votes to win the election, signing the petitions.
So people were really excited about the possibilities here.
Yeah, and we didn't put petitions in the black boxes. We wanted to stay as far away from the racial problems as we could. But the Klan people came and beat up one of our labor people out at Harrison Park. And they beat him up early in the day. So we got his pictures on the final edition of the Birmingham News with blood running down his face. Lloyd Davis, I'll probably see him tomorrow. And they sabotaged us. They had people volunteer to run booths and then not show up. We had to hire Kelly girls. Some of the booths weren't really open all day. We'd probably done better if they hadn't done that. But that's one of the tricks of politics. And I then called the mayor. And I'd met with him several times in that week beforehand because he had run an ad. Art Hayes had run an ad when he ran for mayor supporting a change to city to mayor council government. And I told the mayor, I said, we've got over 11,000 names. And we're going to hold a press conference in about 30 minutes. And you've got really 3 choices. You can support us, and you may be mayor of this city for the next 50 years. You can oppose us, and I think that's a bad political position for you to take. And if you can't take either of those, say, I'll call the election and let the people decide. This is a question for the people to decide. Well, the morning paper came out. Mayor says, we'll call the election and let the people decide. I understand that Bull Connor earned his name that morning. He came down the hall with flames virtually spouting from his nose. And because his office was in the north end of the building, the mayor in the south end. And when the Birmingham News came out, the mayor refuses to call the election. He said he discovered that David Vann was a communist and he didn't call elections for communists. But the law provided if the mayor refused to call the election, the probate judge should call the election. And it just happened that the probate judge had been in the legislature, had been one of the sponsors of the Mayor Council Act. And one of the things they did, they started attacking us because some petitions you file in the courthouse, you have to pay, seems to me it was 10 cents a name or $1 a name, but I think it was 10 cents a name. And that we were getting our petition checked free. I said, well, I'll deposit the money. And I literally raised that money walking from 2nd Avenue to the courthouse. People stopped me, gave me $20 bills, $10 bills. And by the time I got to the courthouse, I had $750, which is what I needed. And I went to see Judge Meeks, said, I brought my $750. Well, the law doesn't require you to do that. Judge, I have brought $750. I want to deposit with you to cover the checking of the petition. And so he said, all right. And he took it and gave me a receipt. After the election was over, he called me up and said, you ready to get your money back? And he returned the $750 after we won the election. But
how were you pictured then? Were you ever under attack as a result of the role that you played?
Oh, yes. People threatened to kill me. There were a lot of people making trouble for the law firm. I really had to resign from the law firm. They were very fair to me. In fact, they paid me my salary for a year after that.
But
and
you had to resign from the
I
firm.
resigned from the firm. And you see, we won that election in November of '62. The same day George Wallace was first elected governor of Alabama, the people of Birmingham voted to take a new course. And then I was one of a group that went to Boutwell and asked him to run. He was the outgoing lieutenant governor, a member of my church, and a very good man. But he was part of the culture that we had. And he had sponsored an amendment to the Constitution to freedom of choice on schools. But he agreed we had to change. And Tom King ran. Tom had run the year before. In fact, the Freedom Rider thing happened in the middle of the mayor's race in '61. And although Tom had led the first, he came in second in the runoff, and Haynes was elected.
At the same time,
Tom ran, and then Connor, when I went out, I ran around like a big, we had 8 speakers. I was one of them. And we went around with charts running like a civics class, talking about here's this form of government, here's how it works, and here's this form. And in the commission government, there's no checks and balances. The same people pass the taxes, spend the money. Over here, you got a council and a mayor, and the council passes the laws, and the mayor administers the laws.
Did you go to any black communities doing that?
No, look, I stayed away. I didn't even dare call a black person on the telephone because I was sure my telephone was tapped.
So then these 8 individuals never really went out to the black community to get in.
As a matter of fact, we were trying to stay as far. That's what Connor wanted to do was.
Associate.
Well, for instance, the first thing I did after it was clear we were going to have a thing, and I was in charge of running the campaign. I sent an ad man to both television stations to buy television time. I wanted a half hour of television the night before the election. Both stations refused to sell me television time. They said changing the city government is not a matter of sufficient public importance to justify the opening of television time. And yet about a week later, they both decided it was important enough for them to do a documentary. Well, the election had to be a 3-way election, mayor, council, commission, or city manager, with a runoff between the top 2. And the commission's ace in the hole was to get enough people to vote for the manager government to have a runoff. And that was our worst enemy. And there was nobody in town campaigning for the mayor, for the city manager. And both television stations hired a political science professor, one from Montevallo and the other from the University of Alabama, to come in and talk for 10 minutes on how great the city manager government was. And at that time, most political science people thought the city manager government was the best form of government. And it is a good form of government for smaller cities, but large cities, it never really worked that well.
What was their motivation in having people to come in to talk about the city manager form?
Well, I think, I don't know, but I know I didn't like it because I wanted to win without a runoff. And if enough people voted city manager, that would force a runoff. And in those days, in politics, for the runoff, you ran ads in the paper showing how the black people had voted at Legion Field, how the black people had voted at the municipal auditorium, and scare all the white folks, and you win the election. It was the opposite of the bloody shirt in Ohio, but it was a bloody shirt. And most people thought that if we had to have a runoff, we would lose. So, but it turned out that we won without a runoff by about 2 votes in each box. If 2 people had voted the other way in each box in Birmingham, we would have lost. It was nip and tuck. Yep. And then Connor, who had said, when I would go out speaking, I'd say, if you like Mr. Connor, elect him mayor, but we need a new form of government. And he would, of course, say, no, I'll never run for mayor. I'll never run for mayor. And of course, he immediately did run for mayor. And there was a runoff. But the runoff didn't help them because the black voters had voted for Tom King. And Boutwell had a few black votes, but not a lot. And Connor had none. And so when they were in the runoff together, they were unable to use the traditional bloody shirt politics to beat Batwell, and Batwell ended up winning very handily in the runoff.
At the same time that this is going on, something else is taking place of significance in Birmingham.
I think the SCLC was having a national meeting here.
That's right.
And they didn't want to interfere with what we were doing. They thought voting Connor out was a pretty good thing. Business people were having meetings. I had one meeting they invited me to at the Church of the Advent. That was the first time I met Shuttlesworth. Shuttlesworth came in the room and he said, "Oh, that's David Vann. I've been wanting to meet him," because he read about me in the newspaper. And they nearly had some things put together, but Connor's group sent word from City Hall that if you take those signs down, you're going to jail, and we'll run picture of paper of Mr. Pizitz himself behind bars in the city jail.
Talking about the colored and white signs.
They were talking about taking down the colored and white signs. And so it was really pretty obvious that to make any rational resolution of our problem, Connor had to go. And remarkably, I know I had people that were my friends in the business community call me and say, "David, you know you can't win this thing. Please be ready to protect it. Don't, be careful what you say." And
how did you view SCLC coming into town at the time?
Let me say, I was so busy doing what I was doing, I didn't worry about it. Now, Smyer and his committee did worry about it. They met with some of them, I think, and they sort of talked it out and decided that they would be careful not to try to interfere with the political. Black people got tired of being kicked around for the politics, I'm sure.
There were efforts by the movement to have meetings with this, I don't know whether it's the senior citizens at the time.
That's what they did. And there were some meetings.
In the initial stages, though, was it true that the businessmen refused to meet with Shuttlesworth?
Well, let me say, I think they refused. People were. Shuttlesworth had a firebrand, and he no longer lived in Birmingham. He lived in Cincinnati. And that sort of gave people, see, we'll talk with the local leaders, but we can't talk with you. You're from Cincinnati. But I know I attended one meeting with the businessmen that Shuttlesworth was president at. But Fred was always eager to stir things up. And I've told him, I said, Birmingham thought you were in a trap.
Well, he was always eager to do what?
To
stir something.
To get something in the paper.
Oh, okay.
And we've always said, he could call Bull Connor and say, "Bull, I'm going to get on the bus at 2nd Avenue and 19th Street at 2 o'clock this afternoon." And Connor come arrest him. And there's a newspaper story. It made Shuttlesworth a hero with his followers. It made Connor a hero with his followers. What's a poor city going to do when it's trapped in that kind of thing? But anyway, Barney Monahan was the president of Vulcan Materials. I know he headed up a group, and they actually had some near agreement on some things. And I've heard that said, that they backed out, they agreed to do it and then backed out. But they backed out because the city government threatened to use all the force it had to prevent it from happening and to arrest the businessmen. And then after we won the election, Connor and his group refused to leave office.
Right.
And the city commission had actually announced a week or so before the new government was sworn in that they weren't going to leave office. And that gave King's people a chance to, and I remember I was on a program with Wyatt T. Walker, and he said, we talked about it, and there was a lot of pressure on us to wait and let the new government have a chance to deal with this. The president, the attorney general, a committee of black ministers. I heard Andrew Young say, I said, "Why do you want to go to Birmingham?" He Said, even the black preachers don't want you to come to Birmingham. And of course, there was a problem. You know, the black political people had worked their fingers to the bone to change the city government, to elect a new government. And I sat in on some of Bowell's meetings with them, and Bowell had made some pretty surprising, to me, commitments to them.
Like what, for instance?
About black police officers and other things. And I don't remember the details, but they felt they had chips on the table and that King was going to come here and pick up their chips and claim credit for them. That's, some of them felt that way, I think.
Who were these leaders that you...
Well, I'm talking about the black political leaders.
Political leaders here in town.
Yeah, the ones that had worked so hard to win the election.
Okay.
Here's somebody coming from out of town to claim credit for what we've accomplished. You know, if you work on something real hard, you feel like you got an investment in it. And actually, until the children started marching, the black community was really split. I remember I was talking to a black businessman. I think it was the editor of the Birmingham World, Dr. Gaston, said, talking to him, and I probably talked to both of us, the truth of the matter. But I can remember, I think the editor of the Birmingham World, I was talking to him, and he was very anti-King.
Emory Jackson.
Emory Jackson. He said, you know, they say they don't get paid anything. All he gets an expense account. Says, I was over at the motel. Whew, I'll swap my salary for their expense account any day. You know, statements like that. But then he said, Lawyer Vann, said, I'm looking out my window. Said, they've turned fire hoses on children. They're rolling a little girl down the middle of the street. I can't talk to you no more. And the minute Bull thought by getting the dogs and the hoses, he'd stop it. And actually, strategically, that was the worst thing he could have done. In an instant, if there was any dissent in the black community, it disappeared. Instantly, everybody was behind it. And the interesting thing is, you know, the sheriff over in Albany, Georgia, had pretty well defeated King. When King got himself arrested, and he thought he wanted to be in jail and talk from the jail, the sheriff put up his bond and wouldn't let him stay in jail.
In Albany.
In Albany, yeah. And when they arrested people, they sent them to jails in other towns. And the strategy was to fill our jails, and Connor just cooperated with it. Wyatt T. Walker said, this will be our last chance to march against Bull Connor. And they knew him so well, they knew how he would react. And I always tell people, the hoses and the dogs, that was Bull Connor's show. That was not our show. Connor did not speak for Birmingham at that point. He'd been rejected by the voters 3 times in the previous 6 months. The Circuit Court of Jefferson County held he was no longer legally an official of the city, and he was there only by virtue of an appeal pending in the Alabama Supreme Court.
Wyatt Walker obviously though suggests that Bull Connor was the best thing that ever happened.
Oh,
as far as
sure.
the movement was concerned.
Well, if you go back, the thing that really persuaded the business community that Birmingham had to change, they had to find a way, using all the skills and pressure and power they had, to make change, because of what Bull Connor did with respect to the Freedom Riders. And it's interesting that, you know, back in the 20s, we had the largest Ku Klux Klan in Birmingham of any place in the United States. But the Birmingham business community did not support the Klan. The newspapers did not support the Klan. And by 1932, the Klan was pretty well dead in this county.
How did the Klan get to be so important? Because at that time, it was basically a fact that a person who's running for office, if they were not supportive of the Klan, they couldn't get elected. Is that true in the 1920s?
I'm told that, and I asked Justice Black about joining the Klan. He said, well, I joined every organization that had members of the jury. I tried jury cases. And I think that's probably true. You know, they changed the form of city government in 1911 from a mayor and council to a commission, and the commissioners weren't elected. They were all appointed by the governor. The first act of that new city commission was to appoint Hugo L. Black, Recorder's Court judge of the city of Birmingham. And I'm told that he refused to put black people in jail for gambling until they started arresting the white people at the country club for gambling. He said it's not right to treat one way and the other. The only case he ever took to the U.S. Supreme Court was the Lewis case. Lewis was a black convict leased to a mining company. Had an accident, broke his back, or some serious injury. And Black represented him and got a judgment against the mining company. And the mining company filed bankruptcy to avoid paying the black man his money. And Black took it to court. And he lost. He lost in the Alabama Supreme Court. But he took his case to the informa pauperis, to the United States Supreme Court. And he personally he got on the train and personally took his papers. And when he got to the Supreme Court, at that time, the Supreme Court actually didn't have a building. It heard its cases on the first floor of the Capitol building. If you go there today, they'll show you the old Supreme Court building. And the justices had their offices at home, but there was a clerk's office. And the clerk refused to accept the judge's petition for certiorari. And the judge said, well, it's in the rules that a pauper can bring his case. He said, yeah, but we don't take those. If we ever started taking informa pauperis cases, we'd be flooded. And Black said, well, I want to speak to Justice Sanford, who was the judge assigned to the Fifth Circuit. And he said, Justice, it says here in the rules I can file this paper. But the marshal, the clerk will not accept it. He says it's a policy not to accept informal pauperis cases. And Justice Sanford called the clerk in and ordered him to allow Justice Hugo Black to file his case. And he won his case, reversed it, and Lewis ultimately got his money. But I think those things spoke for the judge. And I really take him at his word when he says, I joined every organization. Because, frankly, I don't think I don't think he would have been elected senator without support of the Klan.
Mm-hmm. So the Klan was, in fact, a very powerful
Very powerful. But between the 26th election and the 1932 election, the Klan had virtually disappeared from Alabama politics.
If they were not supported by the politicians nor by the business, who supported them? How did they get to be so powerful?
Well, they made, there's a lot of times people get too big for their britches. And they would go into churches and make donations and make a big to-do of it. And again, I don't think the politicians supported the Klan. I think you're looking at democratic government again. There's great strength of democratic government. There's also the weakness that the public is somewhat fickle. It can change its mind quickly from one year to the next. And that's why we have a Bill of Rights, to protect people against those changes. And no matter that government simply some things it just can't do to protect the individual freedom. And that's what the 14th Amendment ultimately did to protect the blacks, people of this country. But it took it 100 years because in 1901, there was enough racial prejudice on the Supreme Court itself. The Supreme Court owed it to correct that mistake because it made the mistake. But if you look back in some of the histories like C. Vann Woodward's books on that period, immediately prior to 1901, the Populist Party was a biracial party. It had black candidates and white candidates. But the minute they took the vote away from the blacks, the Populist Party virtually became the party of the Klan.
Absolutely.
Because that's where the support was. A lot of people think Cobb was elected governor of Alabama on the populist ticket and it was stolen from him. Of course, Black came from Clay County, which was a heavy populist area. And populism left an imprint on Alabama that practically every successful office holder for many years was basically a populist. Now, as a populist, He could be liberal or he could be conservative, depending what the issue was. And people looked at these people as being very different. But really, you know, Lister Hill, John Sparkman, George Wallace, Hugo Black, Bibb Graves, they all came out of the same basic political ideology. Some stressed one thing, some another. Of course, ultimately George Wallace met with the black leaders and said, look, I did the wrong thing. I made a mistake. I shouldn't have done it. And being good Christians, the black voters accepted his apology and forgave him when we had a chance to get a bright young new, lo and behold, Wallace, the smart politician, figured out how to get a large part of the black vote and overcome Macmillan.
Yeah.
You know,
David, throughout the history of black people in this country, there seem to be instances where seemingly what was good for black people were not good for the country, and vice versa, was good for the country. Let me just ask you, what in fact would have happened in Birmingham if Bull Connor had not done what he did?
Well, let me say, at the time, I sincerely believed that we had pulled off a political miracle, that we had proved that the democratic structure can successfully make changes. And of course, I had won a victory that, you know, people just said, there's no way you can beat Bull Connor, but we did. Partly he beat himself. He did a lot of ridiculous things.
What the point I'm raising, what would that have done for race relations in the city? Would they have been any different? Would there have been changes made?
Well, I think, let me say this. I think that election had strange results. I think we had a decade of black and white working together in unprecedented ways. In fact, the city was recognized as an all-American city because of the level of cooperation. One of the first things the city council did when it took power in July of '63, it repealed every segregation law in the books of the city of Birmingham in one city. And that was essential because we had made agreements unsigned. You know, I see a lot of historians say that this was signed on such and such a day. That the settlement, the racial settlements in '63 was never signed by anybody. It was announced by Smyer and by King. And it required the desegregation of lunch counters, the removal of the racial signs from elevators and restrooms and drinking fountains and all those things. Required a beginning of an employment program to hire black clerks in downtown stores. All those things were illegal under the laws of the city of Birmingham. And Bull Connor had hired every policeman. The new government had a police department, all of whom were hired by Bull Connor. And it was essential that before we began, we had a 60-day cooling off period. When that 60 days was over and the time came we had to start actually doing those things, we had to have those laws off the books, or it's hard to blame a policeman for not enforcing a law that's on the books, you know. So we had to get those off. And the new mayor and council had the guts to do it. And we created about 11 biracial committees on every subject you imagine: taxation, recreation, schools. I think we call our school committee the committee to support the school board. And Connor had appointed all members of the school board. And the law firm that represented him represented the school board. So we had to go into the desegregation of schools. And I'll say Reed Barnes was a lawyer from that firm. No lawyer ever performed a professional service any better than Reed Barnes. A lot of people are unaware, but there was never a hearing on school desegregation in Birmingham. It was done by agreement from the very first day until this day. There's never been a hearing, I don't think, because the the NAACP lawyers and lawyers for the school board have been able to work out the various steps along the way. The first desegregation was in September of '63. This new government hadn't been in office but 2 months. It handled the most emotional thing,
But there were also marches even after the new government came in.
Yes, there were
different interpretations of what those agreements were.
Oh, yes. As a matter of fact, some of the ACHMR people tried to start them over again about 10 days afterward. And they put out handbills in the schools. And I called Andrew Young and I said, these break our agreement. And Andy got on an airplane, came over, sat down. He looked at him, he said, you're right, it breaks the agreement. He gets on the phone, he calls Dr. King. He says, this is wrong. We agreed to do something, and now people not want to honor the agreement. King himself came. Got here about 2 o'clock in the afternoon that day. And they got a group of the high school leaders over at the Gaston Motel. I was not there, but I saw it on television. And King said to them, he said, look, we've made this progress to open the doors of opportunity to you. And I want you to go back to school, learn your lessons, prepare yourself for the opportunities that lay ahead of you. Well, they weren't too enthusiastic. That sounded good, but they were young people, and they thought marching was sort of fun. If you look at the pictures of the hosing, they're black kids dancing in the hosing. I mean, it's obviously you're not going to have any standing among your peers unless you get arrested.
But there were also disagreements between Smythe and Shuttlesworth in terms of how they had interpreted the agreement.
Yes.
Smythe said that there was one person.
Fred did not want it to stop.
But by the same token, Fred was raising a very serious question. He said, this is what the agreement, the disagreement was over how many people, how many blacks would be hired in stores. Smythe has suggested that one person would be hired in one store. Fred was saying that the agreement was to have at least one person in every store.
Look, there's no doubt. As I say, the agreement was never signed.
Right.
It was read by both. But if you look at what King said, we would start a program of employment, and we would start with at least 3 clerks in downtown stores. I'll be honest with you, I had a commitment from 5 stores to put on a black clerk. But I said, when the push comes to shove, and when they start breaking the windows of the stores, some of those folks are going to back out. And so I only gave 3. I promised 3. Dr. King knew that. Now, Shuttlesworth wasn't there. But I understand he had a press conference in New York. And so he said, you mean you settled for 3? Well, I meant 3 in every store. Well, once Fred commits himself to something, he's going to follow it down the line, and he did. But King came back and stopped him, and the children did not march again. They took King at his word, and I've always thought it was very important that the last speech that King made in Birmingham as a part of this episode in his life was a speech to the school children of Birmingham, saying, we're opening opportunities for you. You need to apply yourself. You need to get ready, because you're going to have better opportunities than any of the people of our race that preceded. And I saw that on television. As to where that tape exists anymore or not, I do not know.
Well, obviously, those were some very turbulent days, and it was a period, a turning point in the history of Birmingham.
I think it was a turning point in the history of America.
And it
A
changed.
group of businessmen went and met with Kennedy. They had a 15-minute appointment. He kept them 2.5 hours. And I believe up until that day, the Kennedys thought this was too hot an issue to raise until after the next election. But when he saw that Birmingham had made a voluntary agreement between its business community and its black community, and it had the guts to carry it out, and it wasn't easy. Parisians had every ounce of glass in Parisian store was broken that night. Emil Hess, bless his heart, he called every glass company in the county. By the time the sun came up, Every window was intact. There was no broken glass. Whoever did it came back to admire his work. I said, God, was I in another city or something? There were people, like the night Dr. King was assassinated, I got a call very shortly after from a black businessman. He said, we've got to go to work. We can't let the sun rise on this. And we got phone calls in both the black and white communities going all over this city during that 5-hour period. By the time the sun rose, we were able to announce a memorial march from 16th Street Baptist Church with special services in honor of Dr. King on the steps of the courthouse. And the leader of every denomination in this city, black and white, met at 16th Street Baptist Church, and they had a memorial march in honor of Dr. King and a service at the courthouse. And this was virtually the only major city in the United States where no buildings were burned, no riots were held. And you know what was happening in Detroit? They had to send 2 airborne divisions into Detroit to stop the protest. And you know, and you say, well, silly, why do they burn down their own houses? Well, people in emotional states do a lot of things that are illogical, you know. But Birmingham, we had black and white people that kept that from blowing the top off. And it could have. I'd have very few cities in the United States where Dr. King was held in greater esteem by the black community. And those things don't happen by accident. I always tell people, nothing happens unless somebody makes it happen.
So how would you characterize Birmingham then in relationship to other cities where race relations is concerned today?
Well, I think our race relations today are not as good as they were 10 years ago. The two races have pulled apart in a lot of ways. The politics has something to do with it.
Is that because of Birmingham being now predominantly a black city?
That has something to do with it. You see, I insist that segregation was not a matter of laws. It was a matter of inbred customs. The thing that held the system together was not so much the Bull Connors. They were people that responded to something, and they made a political play out of it. George Wallace knew he could go to Chicago and find people that were very strong racists that would vote for him if he would go to Chicago. And he found people in Wisconsin, and he found people all over the country. But what I'm saying is that race relations are either getting better or getting worse all the time. It's an emotion. There are a lot of emotions attached to it. It's almost human nature for people that are different or look different to be suspicious of each other, whether it be prehistoric tribes or it be the Middle East or it be Armenia and Azerbaijan or
in the world, it doesn't matter.
Croatia. It takes a lot of civilization to deal with that. And I think from 60 on through Jimmy Carter, whoever was president realized that to have good relations race relations in America was very important, that the President of the United States make it very clear that this is what we need to do. Now, after that, the Republicans really set about on a Southern strategy that was begun, I don't think by Nixon, but during the Nixon days. I think Nixon, for all his criticism, he stood well on this issue. But they saw that they needed to take the South away from the Democrats. And they were very careful to actually raise racial issues and come down on what they considered to be the white side of the issue. And over and over and over. And Bush did the same. And I'm not saying they were mean-spirited. I'm sure that they would consider it very unfair to say this was racist. But I don't think there's any question. For instance, I think the enthusiasm of the Bush administration in setting up the gerrymandered black districts was in part a realization for every black district we create, we'll create 4 Republican districts. By reducing the Democratic vote in these districts, we can take over the Congress. And I think a big part of taking over the Congress had very little to do with that contract with America. It was mainly that they gerrymandered the districts to reduce the Democratic office holders and increase the Republican office holders, at the same time appeal to the black because he's getting more black congressmen. He might get a black congressman that'll vote his way, but lose 3 others that would have voted his way. The world is full of unintended results.
Absolutely.
It's like they're building prisons. They want to put everybody in prison, but they don't want an education program in the prison. Well, let me tell you, young people are going to be learning something. And I think we're creating crime universities. They're going to go to prison and learn how to be better criminals, and the crime wave will get worse and worse and worse until we begin using prevention. And one of the best prevention programs is take these kids that most of them will test out about the 3rd grade because they were socially promoted, but they were never able to do the work after about the 2nd grade. And I worked with a program at Draper Prison where we took those kids and in 2.5 to 3 years qualified them for a GED. We actually had some scholarship money to send ex-criminals to college. And one of those earned a PhD and has done a lot of good work. I've had, but people say, well, I don't want to help them, I want to punish them. Yeah. Well, they end up punishing their own families unless they approach the problem as rational. They're either going to teach them to be better criminals or teach them to be better citizens. I'd rather teach them to be better citizens. Yeah.
David, I appreciate you.
And this has a lot to do with the racial thing.
Absolutely. Appreciate you taking this much time out of your schedule. We don't have to do this again because obviously you have so much to say. And we'll just have to do this.
Yeah, I've got a few more stories.
I'm certain that you have. And we will definitely get those stories on. We're going to, again, thank you for coming out today.
Well, it takes a lot of soul searching.
Absolutely. And you have been a leader in terms of just getting people to think about what this whole issue is about. So again, I appreciate you coming.
Thank you very much.
Okay.